Hello, HIST 340. I hope you're well. This is the very last video lecture of our very strange semester. So, as I mentioned in email 2 weeks ago and then reiterated last week, as long as you're watching the videos, including this last one, and responding to the discussion responses, which I will put up on Thursday, since I'm distributing this to you on Tuesday, give you 2 days to watch it, i.e. are participating in the class that I'm offering in A, that should be no surprise. So this is going to be the last, as I said, full video lecture. What I'll do next week, technically the week of our finals, is just do a short send-off video as we end the, again, strangest semester in CUNY history. So the point of today is just to sort of put a bow on the past 2 to 3 weeks discussions, well, 4 weeks discussions of law, the Constitution, the Civil War, and then the aftermath of the Civil War. Right, so last week, as you remember, we discussed primarily the so-called Reconstruction amendments, in particular the 14th and 15th Amendments, which were a part of the so-called unfinished revolution that is Reconstruction. Again, that term, one coined by a modern historian. But I think a very apt term to describe the promise that the Reconstruction held and ultimately helps us to understand some of the obstacles to achieving permanent, lasting racial equality in terms of political rights and civil rights. And I think you all did a really good job. Those of you who responded last week to the discussion response did a good job of putting your finger on that, right? That there are several different ways of looking at the Reconstruction, and as I said last week, depending on the lens one chooses, you can get to very different interpretive angles of the promises, both fulfilled and unfulfilled, of Reconstruction. And the point of today, which corresponds to pages 215, roughly 215 to 220 in the textbook, The Blessings of Liberty, and also is relevant to the 2 cases that I asked us to read for this week, in R.E. Slaughterhouse cases, and the much more well-known Plessy versus Ferguson case, is to really get into the aspects of the Reconstruction that we would, I think most people today in the 21st century would call the ultimate failure of the intentions of Republicans during the period of Reconstruction, with reference to, again, securing lasting, permanent civil and political rights for people of color, African Americans primarily, especially in the southern states, right, the former Confederate states. And that's taking us roughly from the time period, about 20 years, from 1876 until 1896, although those years can be pushed back and pushed forward, depending, but roughly about a 20-year period. And the overwhelming theme of this period, with reference to the Constitution, is the rollback of national government responsibility as per the 14th and 15th Amendments. A rollback of national government responsibility, but more precisely national government authority over protecting individual civil and political rights, again, for African Americans and people of color in general. And the mechanism by which this was accomplished by white Southerners was through using state laws, individual state laws, and we'll discuss some of those, and using state and national court systems to challenge the expansiveness in terms of the application of the 14th and 15th Amendments in particular. So the opening year for this sort of chronology, which I'm offering today, 1876, begins with a famed, or infamous is likely the better word for this, compromise that was made as a result of the election of 1876, the presidential election of 1876. And this is discussed, by the way, if you want a little bit more detail, pages 212 to 215 in Blessings of Liberty, so just a couple of pages before the technical reading for this week. But which in short, most historians, including the historian who coined the term unfinished revolution, usually date as the end of Reconstruction. This, in brief, compromise of 1876 settled an extremely close presidential election between the Republican candidate, the excellently named Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Democratic candidate Samuel J. Tilden. This was so close that it was, as per the Constitution, decided by the House of Representatives through a vote. This is enshrined in the Constitution, that in a scenario in which no candidate wins 50% or 50.1% of the Electoral College votes, then the election is decided by Congress. And in this case, Rutherford B. Hayes won by one Electoral College votes, 185 to 184. In any case, without going into too much unnecessary detail, this election was decided through a compromise in which congressional Republicans agreed to end the last vestiges of Reconstruction policy, most importantly by agreeing to withdraw the remaining federal troops, United States Army troops, which were stationed in the former Confederate states. It's not made entirely clear in pages 212 to 215 of Blessings of Liberty, but I would just point out that the vast majority of federal troops had already been removed before 1876, but this is the formal end of the occupation of the former Confederacy by the federal army, the Army of the United States. And this process, that was culminated in the Compromise of 1877, the retransfer of power within the former Confederacy from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, is a process that is usually called variations of the term redemption. So it's referred to as the Redeemer movement, a movement by white Southern conservatives with racist policies in mind to take back control of their states from the Republicans, to take back control of state legislatures, state courts, governorships from Republicans in order to reimpose racist policies, discriminatory policies on Southern blacks. And this process, of imposing, with the sanction of the state and national courts, imposing discriminatory racist policies in the southern states, is typically referred to as the creation of the Jim Crow South, the creation of legal structures of civil and political discrimination, economic, social, basically any form of discrimination one can think of, against black Southerners. And that's dominant theme for this class, and it's in many ways the dominant theme for this period of American history. And we can see this process unfold after 1876 through a series of court cases that, in effect, and this is pointed out on Blessings of Liberty on page 216, that in effect narrowed the definition of rights that was contained within the 14th Amendment. And this is clearest in the first case that I asked us to read for this week, that is called the slaughterhouse cases, is the usual the phrase that's used to name them, but a series of cases not having anything directly to do with race relations, which would end up having a huge impact on race relations in the southern United States. They're called the slaughterhouse cases because they, as you can read in the overview of the case, which is, or the background of the case, which is again on Blackboard, as is all the other cases that we've read this semester, having to do with a challenge to New Orleans city slaughterhouse policy. So again, this is an example of a case that has nothing directly to do with race relations per se, and the facts of the case have nothing to do with race relations at all, but because the case engaged the 14th Amendment, ended up having a tremendous impact on the next several decades of legal history of the American South. So if you just read quickly the facts of the case, the case overview, and I'll just quote from it. A group of butchers in New Orleans opposed a charter that was given to one company, the Slaughterhouse Company, to operate a monopoly for 25 years in New Orleans. So again, nothing to do with race relations. But the case, as it was argued up the chain of the United States judicial system, from the Louisiana state courts up through the United States circuit courts and eventually all the way to the United States Supreme Court, rested on an argument that in effect said that the slaughterhouse monopoly that was granted in New Orleans denied the other slaughterhouse operators equal protection of the laws. And again, reading from the case overview, quote, deprive them of liberty and property without due process of law in violation of the 14th Amendment. What's most important about this case, and the case, the decision itself is relatively short as far as court cases go. It takes a little bit of digging to sort of get at why this case was in fact so important, is that the case, as is also discussed on page 216 of 215 and 216 of Blessings of Liberty, in effect separated national and state citizenship from each other in terms of the eye of the law, sort of narrowing the original intent of the 14th Amendment, which was to secure, most importantly, national citizenship for African Americans, former enslaved people. What this decision did was neuter, by narrowing the definition of what national citizenship was to a relatively small number of obligations the national government owed individual citizens, there we go, thereby making the entitlements of citizenship, reverting them back to individual state responsibilities. So what this did then, again, even though this case had nothing to do with race relations on its face, is gave southern state legislatures and southern courts the federal government's imprimatur through this decision to begin legislating, passing laws that discriminated very clearly against Black Southerners. And it's not a coincidence that it's in the years after 1876, but really beginning in the 1880s and moving into the 1890s, that we see individual, both state but also more local in terms of county ordinances, laws which cumulatively over the course of from about, let's say 1880 to put a round number on it, until 1910, so for about over a 30-year period, collectively became the system of Jim Crow, of legal segregation of public spaces that led to a escalating process of disenfranchising African Americans through a variety of mechanisms, through poll taxes, meaning taxes, payments that had to be made in order to be able to vote in an election, which discriminated against Southern Blacks because they were in most states high enough that it disenfranchised blacks because they were unable to pay the poll tax. Other mechanisms, and you've probably learned about this in various other contexts, other classes as well, include if I can speak correctly, grandfather clauses, state and local ordinances that enfranchised individuals only if their grandfathers had been enfranchised, meaning that a person in 1880, again, to pick a round number beginning this time period, could vote, but only if their grandfather had been able to vote. And this was flagrantly designed to disenfranchise the vast majority of black Southerners because in a year like 1880, the vast majority of black Southerners, and this is even limited to men as well, just to point out, the vast majority of black men's grandfathers had been enslaved and therefore obviously couldn't vote. So it's another mechanism in addition to poll taxes. Others included literacy tests, being asked to read and interpret sections of the Constitution in order to qualify to vote. This disenfranchised, in addition to the poll tax and grandfather clauses, many black Southerners who were illiterate or barely illiterate. And interestingly enough, just to point this out, and I think this adds another layer into the intentions of Southern leaders, these so-called redeemers, these mechanisms of disenfranchisement, but especially the poll taxes and the literacy tests in particular, actually disenfranchised many white Southerners as well. So there's a way you could think about this as, yes, clearly rooted in racial animus, racial discrimination, but also rooted in class discrimination as well, right? That it turns out that not the grandfather clause, which was clearly aimed at the grandchildren of former slaves, but the poll tax and the literacy tests disenfranchised just as many white people actually in the South as they did black people. And these sort of hallmarks of this Redeemer movement, just to be extremely clear, were all accomplished in a constitutional manner. That's why the slaughterhouse cases were so significant, that they gave legal and constitutional space to Southern states to begin passing discriminatory laws, disenfranchisement laws, without worrying that they would violate the Constitution. So this very much, again, to return to the theme of the unfinished revolution, is evidence that what gains had been made during the Reconstruction were rolled back. And as I said, by 1910, every Southern state, every state in the former Confederacy had erected, through state laws and local ordinances, segregation law. And these segregation laws were further given constitutional, or the Supreme Court's blessing, if you will, but were declared constitutional by the Supreme Court in the second case that I asked us to read for today, which is the infamous, from our perspective, case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a case that enshrined the doctrine of separate but equal as constitutional. And without going too much into the details of the case, you can read, you've likely learned about it before, certainly if you've taken History 104 at Queens College or the second half of American history somewhere else, you've undoubtedly learned about Plessy versus Ferguson. So I don't want to go too much into the details, but it had to do with an attempt to desegregate, Louisiana, the Louisiana railroad system. A law had been passed in the 1880s that segregated the Louisiana railway system. It's called the Separate Car Act, which you can read about in the facts of the case, which required separate cars for blacks and whites. This was challenged by a group you can read of New Orleans residents, lawyers, who picked a man named Homer Plessy to challenge this. And they picked him, one, because he was willing, and two, because he was, you can read, in terms of his racial and ethnic background, 7/8 Caucasian. So a very, very light-skinned man. who attempted to sit on the whites-only car was denied this. The case was taken all the way up to the Supreme Court ultimately, where the Supreme Court decided, with some dissent, that these laws, this law in particular, the Separate Car Act, but by extension all Southern legislation that segregated the races, was legal as long as the accommodations were separate but equal. So establishing this precedent, which would last all the way, this goes much farther into the future and outside of the chronological boundaries of this class, but goes all the way to the civil rights era of the middle 20th century, the 1950s and 1960s. So this doctrine of separate but equal, given its full enshrinement in Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, lasted for 60 years, more than 60 years in some cases. So this is the really the dominant theme, and really what shows us that the Reconstruction within one generation, which held so much promise, the promise of citizenship, permanent citizenship, the promise of permanent voting rights, remembering in the 15th Amendment that these were overturned and a system of racial segregation and discrimination was put into place in the South. Again, lasting just in strict legal terms through the 1960s. Certainly there is still racial discrimination and racial prejudice in the South today. I don't think any of us need to be reminded of that, although I just reminded us of it. And I just want to talk quickly about the North a little bit, since so much of this week and last week were discussions of reconstructing the South, for all the reasons that I talked about last week and earlier in this video. But just a little note about race relations in the North, which were not as significant in terms of racial animus towards African Americans on the part of white Northerners, were certainly discriminatory by and large. So this is just a point to remind us, right, that racial discrimination in this period, the period after the Civil War, was not limited to the South. What we do not see in the North, the states that comprised the Union during the Civil War, was racial segregation on the level of Jim Crow laws in the former Confederate states. But still we see northern states, and especially northern cities and localities, pushing forward with laws which were discriminatory in that they were intended to delimit the areas, especially in cities like New York, for example. Other examples include Chicago, Detroit, Boston, Philadelphia, to a little bit of a lesser extent, to delimit the areas in which Black Northerners could live, and to limit economic opportunities for them. And a term you may be familiar with is called redlining. Is it a red line? City ordinances, and the most famous example of this is in Detroit, where a growing number of Black Southerners had begun to move to work in growing industries by the 1910s and 20s. That's the automobile industry, but also in other northern cities. Chicago is the other major example of this. City laws passed by city councils, city governments, which limited geographically the spaces in which people of color could live. And not coincidentally, these were the areas of cities like the south side of Chicago, for example, and the south and west sides of Chicago, which had poorer housing stock compared to other parts of the city. So while we don't see the dynamics of segregation on the level that we see in the South, in the northern states, I just want to point out that it was there in a more limited form, but that it continued to exist. And as Blessings of Liberty says on page 220, and I'll just read this quote because this really puts a bow on this time period in our sort of very short exploration of the post-Reconstruction period. I'm reading from the middle of the page here. By the 1920s, quote, segregation spread to every aspect of life in the South and to many in the North. Separate, unequal public facilities served Black people throughout the South. The border states, meaning states including Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri in particular, the border states, and in parts of many of the northern states. Such discrimination, continuing to read, did encourage African Americans to establish their own businesses and institutions, and they resisted the system where possible. But even so, right, it's clear that the promise of the Reconstruction, the so-called unfinished revolution, was truly rolled back by the 1920s. And so I'm going to end there for today. This is a relatively short video. Just wanted to sort of dip our toes into the post-Reconstruction period, even though this class is supposed to go to the Civil War. Obviously, I want to take it a little bit farther. So I'll sign off there for today. And again, just a reminder, as long as, again, you are continuing to participate through this week, you'll be offered an A in the class. If you have any questions about anything, just get in touch with me via email. Like I said at the beginning, next week I'll just do a really short video to kind of like really wrap up the entirety of the class and say au revoir for our strange spring semester. So again, get in touch with me if you have any questions, and I will post the discussion board for this week on Thursday, just to give you 2 days to watch this before you respond. Okay, have a good rest of your day, and I will see you one last time through video next week.